Good afternoon or good morning. Please add your name, organization, and location to the chat, and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. As a reminder for everyone to please stay on mute during the presentations. Please add any questions that you have to the chat, and we'll answer them as we have time during the Q&As today. We'll have, for today's session, two presentations from on different topics, split our session in half. So roughly 45 minutes on climate resiliency presented by New Ecology, and then solar from Brian Levy of LMI Solar. And then we have some sort of quick comments at the end on the Solar for All opportunity. So we'll get started. Again, just a reminder to stay on mute. Please add any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll turn it over to New Ecology. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joshua Galloway with New Ecology, and we're a nonprofit organization that works to bring sustainability to underserved populations. Next slide, please. Just a bit about our background. Next slide. So this is a refresher from last time when we spoke about decarbonization and electrification. Just want to set the some groundwork for what we are going to be doing. And so our role, New Ecology and National Housing Trust, are excited to work with you all on this IRA Bootcamp and identifying target properties, setting goals and preliminary scopes of work, and then helping determine next steps. The next 4 parts of the development process will happen after our involvement. And so we're really just to help identify opportunities and get started on the process. Next. Our work starts with reviewing the MBEST, the Excel tool from HUD, and we'd like those submitted in late August, and we're finishing up the additional questions form as well that will go out soon. In September, we will review the scopes of work and then set up meetings with each individual cohort. So there's 5 different cohorts based on the climate zones that people are in. And then we'll move on to the next pieces, but this is just to give you an idea of what to expect. Next, please. So what we're going to look at today is defining resilience, looking at some case studies, and then sharing stories, hopefully your stories from the field, and then identifying some resources. This is a lot of information that we're going to share, and there's not a clear path for what you do next. Most important thing is to work with local resources. And so wherever you are around the country is to find out who can help you identify resilience risks. Sometimes it's a locality will have done a risk assessment, or a region. Really engaging with community members and design professionals helps to set those resilience goals. The good news is there's a lot of synergies between resilience, energy efficiency, electrification, really about making better communities. And then you all will pursue funding sources and implement strategies. And so today we're really just going to talk about what resilience is and what are some of the strategies to deal with this. Next, please. There are many definitions out there. The one we like the most is resilience is adapting to a changing climate. And so it's adapting to change. Change is a constant, and this change just happens to be the climate. And why we're looking at it now is we can all we have all experienced the weather around the country with the floods and the hurricane, the smoke, the heat, and so this is the new normal, and we need to adapt to make sure that we can still live within this context comfortably. Next, please. What do we want our homes to be? We want them to be comfortable. We want them to be durable, energy efficient, and healthy. And all those pieces come together to define resilience. And so resilience is not something that you add on to once you've done other things. Resilience is a core goal and strategy within the design process, within project operations. And so really thinking about how the building can continue and the community continue to operate, even if there's a power outage or a hazardous weather. Next, please. Why are we doing this now? For years, for generations, we've had issues with extreme weather impacting the homes that we live in. The difference about now is funding. And so with the Inflation Reduction Act and other state and local resources, there's finally money set aside for this work. And so that's why we're trying to identify this in the process as you're moving through renovating your properties. Next, please. We like to dig down into resilience a little more by looking at the pieces. And so flood barriers are an obvious item, just making sure that people can still live in the buildings where they are and work in times of higher water. A cooling center, we have a lot of cooling centers here in Baltimore that are in use. Residents who don't have cooling in their homes have a place to go to cool off in the extreme heat. Potable water stored for emergencies and battery backup. Next, please. Other pieces of resilience are really community engagement. And so resilience issues can be flooding or extreme heat, and ways to deal with that is to have a strong community. And so the idea is that a community center or a resiliency hub can serve the residents every day of the year and develop those relationships between people so they know where to get different services. When extreme weather comes in, those relationships have already been established, and then they can help support residents in that way. A resiliency hub or a community room that still operates in a power outage or other extreme weather can be a community room that has backup power, potable water, opportunity for heating and cooling, and then resident comfort with the fan. It doesn't have to be a high-tech thing. It can be as simple as a ceiling fan. The last one, passive survivability. It's kind of a mouthful, but basically it means if you can stay in your home without the power being on and remain comfortable, that is passive survivability. And so if the building is really well insulated and air sealed, then it can protect from the climate extremes. And so in the middle of summer, you could still be comfortable in your home if the power goes out for a couple days. The image on the bottom right is an infrared image that looks at heat loss. And so this is a series of row homes in New York City. And the row home in the center was renovated with continuous insulation on the interior of the home. And you can see that the home is not leaking heat. And so this is a wintertime image. And the heat that's generated by the heating system and the people and equipment inside the building is staying inside the building. And the images on the left and right show that the heat that's generated inside is just going right through that exterior wall. And so resiliency can be a ceiling fan, and it can be a super insulated building built to a passive house standard. And it can be kind of everything in between. And so it's going to be different about where you are and what your property is like as to how you'll define resiliency risks for your property. Next, please. As we do this work around the country, we look at a couple different things. We look at social vulnerability indexes, which look at kind of the less tangible issues with how people live. And so not just the building they're living in, but who they are, their age, income, location, and then the importance of emergency management plans. And so a property can have all of the amenities you can dream of, but if the amenities are not communicated to the residents and to the staff, then they're not going to be as useful. And so one of the most important things is to have a plan and communicate that plan. We look at a lot of data and maps to kind of see where there's impact from storm surges and hurricanes. And then sometimes you just have to go on site. And so on the right, that localized flooding image, this is from a property that was not in a flood zone, but Mother Nature does not care if that spot is in a flood zone on a map or not. If water is coming and there's nowhere to go, it will go through the path of least resistance. Next, please. Thankfully, there are co-benefits. So it's not like you have to put a lot of money and effort to resiliency that you're only going to use if there's a power outage or a hurricane comes through. These co-benefits are increasing the insulation, air sealing, and window quality in your building, makes it more comfortable for residents, makes it easier to heat and cool the space. And so those are some of the things we like to think about. And there are going to be other co-benefits based on your location and your property. Next, please. We're going to look at 3 different properties where we have done resilience assessments. This first one is in Salisbury, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, low-lying area, coastal. And the property owner asked us to do a resilience audit or assessment because the low-income housing tax credit financer said, we need a resilience audit because you're in a coastal area. So the funding groups are starting to recognize that resiliency is a something to pay attention to and have asked for these reports. Next, please. From the office, we look at a series of maps and aerials to get a sense of the property. And this one shows that the property identified by this red mark right here is not in a flood zone, but is adjacent to a flood zone. There is good solar exposure for potential solar PV on the roofs. We identified a neighborhood school just up the street, which could be also a place of refuge in a time of need. And the property is going to go through a renovation. And so that's a perfect opportunity to take care of energy efficiency and resiliency items at the same time. Next, please. When we got on site, we found some additional items. And so this is a blow up aerial looking at the site here. Again, the FEMA flood map shown here. The grade on the surrounding areas slopes towards the property. And so this flood map shows flooding from the river, from the ocean, but not overland flooding. And so water comes down, and as you can see by the mulch on the side of the building, water builds up against the building. There are crawl spaces, and so the water gets in the crawl spaces, and then you have issues with indoor air quality and mold, mildew in the buildings. So these are elements that we put together to think about resilience issues. It's both what you can see from the maps and what you see on site. Next, please. So the FEMA maps that we're looking at, they show flooding risk based on historic data. As we know, the climate is changing rapidly. And so we also want to look forward and see what could be coming from the future. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, has a series of tools based on models that look at what potential sea level rise will look like. And so the image on the left shows sea level at the existing state, and then with 3 feet of sea level rise, water continues towards the site, but does not reach it. And so these are just some tools that we use to help people analyze risks to the property. Next, please. This is from the same source from NOAA, and this looks at storm surge risk. And so if there's a storm that comes through, a nor'easter, it would have an additional impact on the site in addition to sea level rise. And you can see the site location is this dark area right here. And so it's not heavily impacted. The red is the highest risk areas along that coast. Next, please. Another piece in the same NOAA tool looks at high tide flooding. And so high tide, water is higher. Then if you get a storm that comes through, it has even more, could have more of an impact on the site. And so we look at all these tools not to provide us answers, but just to provide a sense of what conditions could be like in the future. Next, please. The social vulnerability index that I mentioned briefly earlier, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they put together this program based on socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, and housing type and transportation. And what this helps show is what are additional risks that may be present on a site that are not readily apparent. And so the use of this tool is for folks to realize, okay, I need to pay attention to if I have seniors on site, it's harder for them to move to another location. They may need more resources if people have in a power outage or an extreme weather event. The level of vulnerability is based on color. So low is the yellow, and then moving up to high. And the site is located in a high vulnerability index. It's 0.9 on a scale of 0 to 1. And so it means when you're doing a resilience assessment of the property, you look at the physical, tangible elements on the site, and also think about how what resources the community could offer to residents in this location. Next, please. So the solutions we came up with for this property were to turn the community room into a resiliency hub as a place of refuge for residents, to regrade the site to make sure water's flowing away from the building, to put together an emergency management guide to really help communicate what the issues are and potential resources to both residents and staff. We looked at probably 200 properties in one state, and very few actually had an emergency management guide that residents and staff had seen and had a copy of. And so super important to make the tool and then to communicate it. And then on the bottom right is a little snip of a calculation we did looking at potential solar PV on the roof and battery storage that would provide power during a power outage, and basically make the resiliency hub or the community room useful for more days of the year. And so it's really useful whenever there's the battery has power. Next, please. I'd like to pass it over to my colleague, Frank, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joshua. So what we're hoping to do here is just give you all a few examples before we turn it over to you and ask how resilience fits into your work, to give you some examples of what we've seen in our work. So here I'd like to just briefly talk about a property in Boston. It's a wonderful 43-unit building that was renovated in 2006. And in 2006, was added to the basement 3 resident units, a common space with heating and cooling, and also a number of offices. Next slide, please. So this wonderful building, as you can see on the right here, has a number of key features that were added. And one of them is an accessible ramp down to those 3 units in the basement. And the image on the far right shows a community room in the basement with heating and cooling and with refrigeration and with a microwave to prepare food. So there are a number of great assets at this building that can be leveraged. Residents also have access to fiber optic internet, and there's an innovative solar thermal system on the roof to offset some of the domestic hot water load. Next slide, please. So when we looked at the risks for this property, we used a locally available tool. And what you're seeing, it's maybe somewhat hard to see here. In the middle of the screen is a pin where the property is located. And at this property, the risks are high heat in orange and red. And also in the bluish color is the risk from stormwater flooding. So knowing these risks, we took a look at the property to see what they could do to mitigate those risks. Next slide, please. And what we suggested, we're at that rear ramp that's accessible that now leads down to 3 units in the basement, is to put up something like an entryway flood barrier, a flood barrier that could be put in place during a flood event to keep that basement as dry as possible. Also to look at things like potable water storage. So as we saw in Texas a few years ago, when the water supply goes offline, it causes a pretty significant crisis. So that could take the form of either keeping potable water available on site or some sort of a collapsible container to provide that to residents. We also discussed with the team the option to have a backup battery available for that community room to keep it online during a time of crisis. Next slide, please. So this is a property which you'll see that has a number of common risks and common assets. And it's another example of ways we suggested to teams that they can build on what they already have in order to leverage their assets to increase resiliency. This is a building in Chelsea with 48 units that was built in 2007. It has a number of key features, including a space of refuge already on site. Next slide, please. So there is a community room already available. There is solar PV already on the roof, which is a great asset. And there are a number of multifamily properties nearby that can be used if residents do need to be evacuated. All of these things were assets to the team. Next slide, please. What made this property interesting when we did the analysis was the fact that about half of the building is in a floodplain already. So there's floodplain exposure. There's also exposure to sewage possibly backflowing because this sanitary sewers are not separated from the stormwater sewers. And there was also a heat exposure risk. Next slide, please. So we were able to uncover some maps looking at, as you can see here in purple along Vernon Street, places where the storm and sanitary sewers were not separated and may present a risk during the flooding events. So we took steps or made recommendations to help mitigate that. Next slide, please. So what do these solutions include? You're going to see some common themes here. One of them is a quick dam type of system or a deployable flood barrier for the units that are exposed, that are in the floodplain, to try to keep water out of the units to the extent possible. We also discussed with the team the potential to add backwater valves to keep that sewage out if there was any risk of it flowing back into the units. And the common theme of having some potable water supply and a possible backup battery for that community space to keep it online. Next slide, please. So as you look at your portfolio, you may find that a number of properties have similar items that they need to be addressed. So whether this be air infiltration testing, to take a look at the envelope and how robust it will be during a power outage, whether that be adding sump pumps to the basement to keep the space clear during a flooding event, even up to simple things like tree trimming to keep power lines free of falling debris during a windstorm. So you may find that there are common themes throughout your whole portfolio. And along the bottom, what we're presenting is a range of costs that can vary from properties that need relatively little intervention to properties that may need more of an intervention, to give you some ballpark idea of the costs the team may face when doing these upgrades. Next slide, please. And I'll now turn it over to Joshua to introduce the breakout session.
Okay, so we have thrown a lot of information at you in a very short amount of time and would love to have a conversation. And so we're going to break up into cohort groups. Those of you who were with us last time are familiar with that. But we'll break up in those groups. We'll chat for about 10 minutes. Cohorts 4 and 5 that are Massachusetts centric, they're going to be organized by the first letter of the organization's name with numbers at the top of the alphabet. A new ecology staff person will be in each cohort and will moderate and take notes. And then one of the cohort members, a lovely volunteer, will just present one of the ideas or opportunities that they heard. So Madeline, if you could give us the opportunity to go into a breakout group. I see it there. And we'll see you there.
If anyone has any questions about which room they should go into, let me know.
Hey, Madeline.
Hey.
Which one do you want me in?
Did you want to go into cohort 1
Sure.
with Washington, Oregon, and California? Perfect.
Okay, great.
Let me know if you have any trouble getting into it.
Oh, I
Hey,
see that.
I have a question. I'm on my phone and I don't have an option to get into a cohort room. Does anybody know how to Zoom on my phone? I'm always on my computer.
I can assign you. Let's see if that works. Which state are you in again?
I'm in Maine.
Maine. Okay. I just assigned you to
Oh,
one.
there we go.
Perfect.
Thanks.
If anyone else needs help, let me know. Otherwise, I can just start assigning you based on our contact list.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back, everyone. Sorry that I left rather quickly and didn't carefully describe the process for getting into the breakout sessions. We had some good discussions in our group, and we want to share just one idea or thought from each group. And we can start with cohort 1, which is Lisa. Did you identify someone in your group, or will you share an idea?
Joshua, we switched. So cohort 1 was actually me. Okay. And Jackie from our group volunteered to share some of the resilience issues that we talked about in our group.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, so we had the Pacific Northwest, California, Colorado area. And we identified that within that geographic region, the threats we're most often facing are wildfires, public service, power shutoffs, earthquakes, and extreme heat. So there was talk of battery backup for resiliency, brush clearing, reducing seismic risk, and air conditioning. It was definitely a top priority. In at least Colorado and Washington, it's becoming, the incidences of extreme heat are becoming more extreme. And so how did we pursue that work? Right now, basically pursuing electrification and fuel switching incentives as a way to also add an air conditioning load. So,
gotcha.
Miss anything, Rebecca?
No, great summary. Thank you.
Lisa.
Yeah, I guess I chose Sunshine to report on our group. We basically shared stories of how each group was starting to implement resiliency in their project.
This is Sunshine at Piedmont Housing Alliance in Virginia. Yeah, it was a pretty diverse set of conversations and insights. Some focused on solar and storage for community centers in high-risk areas, both new construction and retrofit. One group talked about properties that were older properties that are in a floodplain, which is really not mitigatable. So actually looking at the possibility of taking some units offline just to for safety reasons for those families. Talked about single family, doing this kind of work in single family communities or neighborhoods. And then in particular, one group talked about the fact that GRRP is not applicable to HUD 202 in some nuance, and being frustrated by that because they want to do work in older buildings, but that is a missing for them as they try to gear up the funding.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Nadine, can you share something from our group?
Yeah, I would say overarching what we were talking is that resiliency is a new thing, and that we're all sort of muddling our way towards A, the definition, and B, solutions, and that some of us have some ideas on how to do that. It's just a question of finding a funding source to actually get it done. Heat pumps came up as a thing, and just the not even resilience in the sense of the disaster, but just utilities and how that impacts everything. The cost of utilities, I'd say that was kind of an issue as well.
Okay.
And
And Frank,
was that good, Joshua?
sounds great.
Okay.
Frank.
Thank you. So cohort 4 talked about a number of items. One of them that came up was the need to add cooling to resident spaces. So it was a response to a specific need. First, it was done in hallway areas with cooling zones, and then later with some portable ACs and some split systems. So it was a great way to tackle a resident need. Thank you.
Okay, LJ.
So we talked about, I think the key statement was, it wasn't important until something happens. So now it's important. We focused, so we were Massachusetts based, and we talked about flooding being a real issue, and extreme heat and cold. And one of the biggest questions that came up was when you have so many mechanical systems, how do you get proper air circulation? And so, planning for things like that. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. That's super helpful to have some connection and understanding where people are. Next slide, we're right up against our time, and I want to leave some time for questions. There's a series of tools listed on in the slide deck, and we can we'll just put together a little written description about these tools. We don't have the time to go through them now, but again, most important to look at kind of what's available locally for you. Wanted to open it up for questions and see what people have, and if we don't have questions, we could go through more of the slides, but want to open it up for questions. Okay, we'll go through some slides. If people have questions, please go ahead and speak up. Next slide, please. So the HUD Green Resilient Retrofit Program requires a applicant to fill out a FEMA risk hazard tool. And so this is a national tool that people can use to identify risks in their region and at their property. Link there for filling it out. Next. Enterprise Community Partners, wonderful national organization advocating for and providing affordable housing, providing financing for affordable housing, has a lot of great tools. And so in the disaster relief area, and then also multifamily building resilience, all this comes together in their Enterprise Green Communities program, which is a third-party verified green building program, specifically for affordable housing. It's a great tool to use for energy efficiency, indoor health, community engagement, energy efficiency, electrification. And so if you're looking for a guide through this process of renovation and you're doing these efforts, consider using Enterprise Green Communities. Next slide, please. Talking about resiliency hubs, there's some understanding of them. It depends on where you are and what your population, what the needs of your population are. And so a resiliency hub could be in the community room in a multifamily building that has backup power, that has supplemental oxygen, refrigeration for medicines, basically a place where residents could go during a power outage and be heated or cooled, be warmed or cooled, and have a place to charge their phones and things like that. This USDN tool is great for really getting into it. We'll continue to talk about this and other resilience items as we do our cohort and group presentations, and then when we meet individually with you. And so this is not your only time to talk about resilience. We'll continue throughout the conversation. Next, please. Pretty exciting tool, can be used when looking at solar electric systems and battery storage. And so you can use this tool, or one of your consultants can use this tool to look at what's the effectiveness and efficiency of a solar electric plus battery storage system for your property. And then that tool can be used to meet with finance groups to figure out how to finance that. Again, your local resources and architects, engineers can help with this. Next, please. I'm going to pass it over to Frank to finish up. And Frank, we have 1 minute left.
Thanks, Joshua. So in summary, we put together a number of tools. These will, when the slideshow is sent out, these will be clickable links summarizing and assembling the tools that Joshua has highlighted here. And they're focused on the various items as they're titled. So I'd also like to point out that the link on the bottom will take you to a written guide walking you through how to use these tools. So please feel free to please feel welcome to use that as you need. So next slide, please. So what we've tried to do today is to take you through a number of tools and to just bring back to the discussion a number of things to highlight. I think there may be some sort of an error with the slide, but that's fine. What you're seeing here is a property where a number of these things have already been considered. What is the flood elevation? What do we need to prepare for? Is there a space of refuge for the residents? Have we elevated mechanical equipment? and is the envelope of the building something that's robust that can protect residents during an outage, either a heat wave or a cold snap. So what we try to do is introduce a number of concepts and tools and further that discussion, and we hope that's of use to you. And we look forward to getting to talk to you about those in the cohort groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the new ecology team. We'll be turning it over to Brian Levy, a former consultant to NHT's Solar Energy Solutions department and our work there in that space. Sweet. Great. Turn it over to you, Brian. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Pleasure to join you here today. I'm going to give a quick overview of solar developments and specifically focus on IRA incentives. And then I'll try to have as much time for questions at the end because I know there's a number of them. So again, I'm Brian Levy, founder of LMI Solar, and as Michael mentioned, I work with NHT and other clients over the years to develop about 7 megawatts plus of community solar and traditional solar on affordable housing properties. So I wanted to just kind of talk to you first about the big picture here, particularly given where a lot of you are coming from, which is owners, developers of portfolios of affordable housing. And so the approach we've generally taken over the years is to look at a portfolio approach specifically, not just one property here, not just one property there, and then bundle properties together, look at them as a whole portfolio and analyze it and finance it and maintain it as an asset, as a bundled asset. So let's get into it. I wondered if you could forward to the slide. Great. So first of all, the step one, right, which some of you have already encountered, which is scoping the portfolio, right? What are the main things that you're going to need to know, that anyone you're working with to develop the solar with you is going to need to know to kind of kick off the process of portfolio level solar development. So the first is looking, obviously, at identifying exactly where the site is, right? Including any land, rooftop, taking out any no-use areas. Roof age is a key issue here. We often come up with 30 properties in a portfolio, and by the time you look at roof ages, half or more are older than 5 years old. The solar systems we're putting in are typically, they're going to last for 25 years, so you want to put those on a good roof. You definitely don't want to put them on a roof where you then have to go in 10 years, rip it all off, and reinstall it while the property gets re-roofed, right? This is something we want to avoid. Generally, that's not going to pencil very well because it's basically like paying for half the cost of the installation or more if you have to do that. So screening for roof age is key. Also, for each of the properties, looking at what kind of metering is on site. Typically, right, with these affordable housing properties, you're going to have a master meter, covers all the power, or you'll have common area meters and individually metered units. So understanding what the metering situation is at each of the sites is key, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. The fifth thing is utility rates. I have a slide on calculating utility rates. We don't have a lot of time to get into that, but it is at the end of this presentation. It's important to get a read on what you're actually paying for power, specifically what the avoided cost would be were you to do solar. And there's a number of charges and other things that actually aren't directly offset by solar, such as demand charges or standard monthly service charges, which you basically have to discount fully or at least partially while calculating the utility rate. So you just want to get a handle on what you're going to be saving, right? And then we're looking at the solar capacity at the site, right? Whether there's roof, whether we can do roof canopies. This is something that in some markets where the solar economics are strong, we can build roof canopies over all that HVAC equipment, which usually precludes solar. Carports, ground mounts, number of different approaches. So looking and scoping to see what's possible at each site. And then the utility regs in each state, right? It's really broader than utility regs. It's the policy environment that allows solar to work or not. Basically, need to be in a net energy metering state. We can talk more about that a little bit later. and we need to basically make sure we can plug solar in with the utility. And then there's a few other options that we can talk about later in terms of community solar, but I'm not gonna dive into that right now. In terms of also scoping the portfolio, it's important to have a list of lenders on that property. The only reason I say that is a lot of times lenders are great, but a lot of times they're difficult, and it's best to know who you're dealing with before you start down this process. I'll talk about Fannie Mae as a particular not great actor at the moment when it comes to solar later. But if you have Fannie in any of your portfolios, I'd say suddenly that even if it was a perfect site and everything else, they're not really approving solar projects right now, and that will hopefully be changing. But as of 2 months ago, they had been stuck in the water for about 8 months. The last thing for scoping, actually, there's a few more things, is noting the type of federal assistance on the property. A lot of you guys are working with LIHTC properties or Section 8 HUD. It's important to understand what kind of federal assistance applies to that building so that we can calculate your IRA credits, which I'll get to shortly. And there's a bunch of like simple, stupid stuff that we need to take into account, like, is there shade? What's the southern exposure? Is the site, if it's a ground mount, is it in a floodplain? And then lastly, I get a question a lot, is like, is there a minimum size threshold for solar once we've done some of this initial scoping? Yes, it depends on the market you're in. But typically like 25 to 50 kW, just because of the substantial amount of time it takes. If you're bundling a bunch of projects, you can go a little smaller, but you want to have kind of a basic minimum size. Even in strong markets like DC, typically wouldn't touch anything less than 25. So that's kind of the first step, right? Let's figure out what's in the portfolio. What can we work with here? And then there's the rest of the steps. And I believe all of you have received a task list that was sent around previous to this presentation. Have a look at that. I'm not going to go in. I just don't have the time to go through all the steps. What I'd like to do is go to the next slide, which talks about why all those steps might be worth going through, which is the finance, which makes all this worthwhile or not, and specifically get into IRA here. So a lot of folks know this, but just to be really clear, there's basically five benefit streams, 5 categories of benefit streams, right, that come from solar. The first one's the most obvious, right? Everyone knows it's the financial savings, property level electricity savings. And then the second, I should have SRECs, these solar renewable energy credits. Actually, that belongs under a broader category, under like production-based incentives. So these are incentives based on electrical production of the systems, right? It can be feed-in tariffs, they can be SRECs or other types of incentives. The third big category are, of course, the tax credits, we'll talk about in a second. And that also includes federal and state depreciation. And then the last category, which you could have a whole session just on grants, right? And I know we're going to talk about Solar for All in a second, but at the federal level, at the EPA level, you've got Solar for All and other programs. At USDA level for rural, you've got REAP. At DOE, you just have probably a half dozen programs supporting solar on top of the tax credits. Specifically, now that we're in this post-IRA age, we have some specific new incentives, which some of you are maybe familiar about. So when I say ITC, I mean investment tax credit. Previous to IRA, the base level ITC had fallen to 26%. And in a nutshell, what that means is it's 26% of the value of the project, the IRS value of the project, which we can get into. And so now that's been raised to 30%. So that's your base level. And so this graphic over here is going to kind of show you the adders, essentially, that are available. Specifically, many of them are focused on LMI, affordable housing. So there's category 1, category 2. There's a 10% adder on top of your 30%, right? So if you are in a low-income census tract, and there's maps online to help you determine where those properties are located in such areas or not. And category 2 are the tribal lands. So it added 10% for that. Or you can apply for, and again, these are actually all applications. Anytime there's category 1, 2, 3, 4, this is all an application to Treasury, which will be opening up shortly. Category 3 is low-income housing. So if you have like federally assisted housing, you can apply for, and are doing solar, you can apply for an additional 20% adder. The other type of 20% adder is for this low-income benefit project, right? So these are projects that typically are not on site, or they might be adjacent to, but they're connecting to a different, to not the property's main meter. If you're familiar with community solar, that's typically what a category 4 project is, off-site, where you're allocating solar production to meters on to LMI households, which incidentally don't have to be your clients, your property tenants. They can be others as well, and you can still get this tax credit. There's some basic minimum amounts of power allocation at minimum discounts to LMI households that you must comply with in order to qualify for this tax credit. There's a few others which you also might apply. So now you can get 30% or 10 or 20. And then on top of that, you can get this energy community. This may not apply widely to folks here, but energy community for Treasury is defined as like a brownfield or an area where a coal-fired power plant has closed since 2010. Again, there's maps out there that you can use to determine whether you might qualify for this tax credit. And lastly, there's domestic content adder. So on top of your 30 plus 10 or 20 plus 10, you can get up to 70%. That's what this graphic is showing you, right? If you are able to use, in this case, in current 2023, 2024, 40% domestic content in your solar system, which is a little tough, but in some cases, just because there's been a run on like domestic manufactured panels and the like. But if you can get them at a decent price that's less than the markup, maybe it might be worth it, but it's not easy. The domestic content adder is going to be more easily applied in cases of like for canopies, with if you can get a lot of American-made steel for rooftop canopies, for ground mounts even, if you can get that 40% threshold, you can get that 10%. So a lot of these projects, on NHT projects we worked on, we're looking at 50% ITC, so basically half price solar, just to start on top of any grants, SRECs, etc. And then I'm not even going to get into LIHTC, but if you're in a new period where you're getting LIHTC in to your project, if you're adding like on a 4% LIHTC deal and plus 50% ITC, you can get almost like 100% cost coverage. And I model that out in the model I share, the last tab. Don't have time to get into it right now. If we can flip to the next slide, please. So a couple of other IRA incentives that have come up. So for nonprofits, which is a lot of you guys, as you may know, there's this new direct pay option, right? So essentially what this means is that you can build your project, and then previously, right, you had to go seek out third-party tax equity because a lot of nonprofits don't have the tax appetite. By definition, you don't have the tax appetite, right? So right now, what you can do on the IRA with direct pay is get $1 to $1 rebate from the federal government upon project completion, i.e. permission to operate, upon tax filing, back from the US government. And so this is a nice, interesting new way, right, of being able to more efficiently monetize the tax credits if you're a nonprofit. If you're not for profit, if you're for profit, there's another option, which is called the tax credit transfer, where you can essentially like sell your tax credits more easily, versus having to enter into like a third-party tax equity situation, which can get complicated and expensive. The one quick note I will make on the direct pay option is that you're leaving the depreciation value of your solar asset on the table, right? You're a nonprofit, you can't monetize that. You're not selling the project, so someone else can't sell it. You're just selling the tax credits. So that's okay, but there is some value being left on the table versus engaging with another entity that's going to own the project. that does have a tax appetite. I also included for you all, to make this a little bit more real, pro forma, Model A and Model B. And Model A, I believe, was the one with SREX, and Model B was without SREX. And I'm looking at the clock, and I think that we're going to spend just a very, very quick moment on Model B, because it's a little bit simpler. So if you all want to pull that up, well, I don't know if you can pull it up on the presentation, but I'll just go through it very quickly, and then we can talk about it more if you have questions. So this is a pro forma for like a 1 megawatt portfolio. Let's say you've got 10 projects, 100 kW each. This is kind of a standard interconnection. Let's not talk about community solar, it gets a little complicated. And the model here is, I will talk about this more in a sec. The nonprofit entity, let's say, sets up a special purpose entity. And that SPE then is the developer of the solar project, right? And owner of those projects. And that SPE essentially is selling power through what's called a power purchase agreement to the individual properties, maybe at a 15% discount or a 30% discount, depending on the economics. That SPE is then also taking the tax benefits. If it's a SPE owned by a nonprofit, you can do direct pay, right? And then that obviously benefiting from the IRA incentives, any other grant funds, et cetera, goes to the SPE. Just to quickly show you, I know I'm getting some folks saying we not seen the pro forma. So the pro forma, it was a PDF that was attached to the email that you all received, and we didn't bury it into the presentation because it's like 7 pages long. But thanks for sharing. There you go. And it's a little small. I don't know if you can zoom in a bit. The first page is showing the portfolio of 10 projects, system size, the production factor. So you're getting about 1.2 million kilowatt hours. And then you're looking at what the power rate is paid for, right, by your property, and what the total power value is, and then the discount on that, which again, the SP would be giving in this case to the property. So like 15% discount. So you're looking at like a 13-cent power rate where the solar power is being sold to the property. Thanks, Michael. Let's go to the next slide, or the next page on this pro forma. This tab shows you essentially what the construction development costs are for fairly simple rooftop ballasts. You're looking at like, that's over 50 kW, maybe you're looking at like 210, 225, 230 a watt. Don't get too hung up on all these different lines here. If you can keep scrolling down under development costs, what I'll point out on this page is just where we operationalize the IRA tax credit. So you've got, does everyone see the 2.5 million sum of total costs? The direct pay credit rate is $1 per credit. And so if you look over to where it says solar tax credit, 30%, which is kind of the base. And then we're also adding in the 20% tax credit, because let's say it's on a LIHTC building. So you're adding that up, and it's basically showing you're getting about half the value, exactly half the value of the project as tax credit. If you scroll down our sources and uses, that shows up under the 2.5 total, 1.2 tax credit. This model, and again, this is an important lesson for you wannabe solar modelers. We always model unleveraged because it's just a more honest way of looking at things. And if you can bring in debt, and usually makes your returns go up, although in this high interest rate environment, not always. But in any case, there's no perm debt here, although in many cases you're going to have some debt on the project. So that's the sources and uses in a quick nutshell. I didn't include any grant funds, but there's obviously plenty of sources for grants to come into these portfolios as well. Next slide, please. So this is a pro forma, again, kind of tiny, you have to blow it up a bit, but essentially your income on this project is going to be your sale of electricity to the properties, right? And then there's a little adjustment for the degradation Again, this is the non-SREC model, so there's no SRECs for income here. And then there's all the operating expenses, which I won't get into, your NOI, and then your returns. If you can just scroll down a little bit more, you can see on this project, just with the tax credits, it's not stellar, but again, there's no grants, no ITech, no other financial bells and whistles, and also no debt. So you can kind of see your income stream over there. And I think I'm going to skip back to the main presentation now. I think the rest of this you can look at separately. So we're on to the next big question, which is next slide, which is the solar to own or not to own. So these tax credits and other incentives and grants, everything that are out there, you can decide to take advantage of them, yourselves directly as owning the systems, or you can decide to let someone else take advantage of them and then essentially let them pass on some of the benefits to you. This is a fairly complex question to own or not to own, but let's just go over the very high level elements. One is you own it. So you see that task list that I sent around, then a lot of those tasks are going to be on your plate, along with hopefully a consultant or someone to help you work through them, right, to own the systems. Financially, all the benefits you accrue, right? The free or discounted electricity, the SRECs, tax credits, grants, and appreciation if you have the tax liability. But then on the negative financial side, obviously you've got the full project costs that you're incurred. And a couple of things on this that are easily overlooked. So one is you've got to cash flow this project, the solar project, through tax season, right? So you need like construction debt to be able to get these projects like built, and then you file your taxes, and then you get that money coming in from the IRS, which will then hopefully pay off some of the construction debt, and then you go into perhaps a perm debt that's substantially lower than your construction debt. The other thing, if you're going to be taking this on, right, you got to have the balance sheet if you're taking on any debt, to be able to like provide the debt guarantees. This is actually a showstopper, right, for a lot of folks. It's one of the reasons NHTU comes in and helps others in this space develop solar. And then you've got the ongoing, so those kind of the one-time costs, and then the ongoing, you've got the operations and maintenance on the system, insurance, SREC management. These are costs that are reflected in that spreadsheet. By contrast, you can go for third-party ownership, right? And there's other nuanced models here, but I've got 20 minutes here, so I'm keeping it a little simple. So third party comes in, owns the system. They take care of all the scoping, the construction, the legal, the O&M. If you as the recipient of the solar system and the site for the solar, will still have some obligations to review the contracts and be engaged, but it's a lot less management time than if you're going to own the system yourself. And then financially, right, all you're getting in this scenario typically is some discounted power, which hopefully is more than you would have gotten pre-IRA, because whoever owns it is going to be able to get these added incentives. And B, often, you got to ask for it, as a development fee, which can cover some of that staff time, some of that legal time that you're going to need to costs you're going to incur to be able to enter any deal. Let's hop to the next slide. So legal considerations, I think I already covered a bit what the concept is. Again, there's other ways of structuring these deals. I want to just talk through a couple, basically a short list of all the legal docs that if you're going to own the system, you're going to need to be able to review. You've got your site lease, which again is, even if a third party owns it, there's going to be a site lease which you have to review. There's interested parties, right? I alluded to this with like Fanny earlier. If you own the system or someone else owns the system, almost always, but not always, almost always, that third party or you will be required to get those lenders and investors, or just investor on the project, signed off on the solar. And this, I say, is a little bit akin to 3 to 12 months of dental work. Sometimes, as you know, there's the capital stack on these projects. is remarkable. You can have like 4 or 5, lenders and an investor, and all of them have to sign off. And this is really what slows down affordable housing, solar, over and over and over. There's little dents in my wall from where my head bangs, working with certain lenders. I won't name names, but it's just something to go in with eyes wide open on, and perhaps even select projects where you've got lenders that are a little bit easier to work with that aren't going to take a year to approve a 4-page SNDA. Legally, otherwise, you've got your EPC contract, right, with your installer, an O&M agreement, any loan docs, operating agreement. So there's definitely some legal costs involved in these projects, and I think I'd like to switch to the next slide, which is getting to be the last slide, so we can jump into questions, because I know there's a lot of questions. So additional topics. One of the documents that I attached in your packet was guidance document from HUD. One of the things to be aware of is that on these HUD properties, where the use case here is only where the property is tenant metered, and there's solar power being assigned to tenant meters, typically under like a community solar arrangement. There can be the issue where the tenant electricity bill goes down and the utility allowances are recalculated. So some of the benefits are lost. The HUD guidance memo provides a little bit of solace here. Again, I'm not going to get into it, but please have a review. And I'd say if there's questions on this particularly, there is a contact at HUD to reach out to. It can be a little bit complicated to understand what's going on, and how utility allowances may or may not be impacted. So put a pin in that for now. Another question I've gotten is, what about small and scattered sites? The small sites you have to really think hard about. The scattered sites where you've got, like a lot of affordable housing are just these like small units of like 2 to 3 or 4 units, and next to maybe 10 of those on like a campus with limited rooftops. That's tough. That's really tough, particularly with the metering. If you have one master meter, you got to tie all that solar into that meter, but typically they're much more often individually metered. So you're talking about lots of little tiny systems, right? Lots of little 4 kW systems that you're tying into the meter for those 4-unit properties, which gets expensive and complex just logistically to do. So, and I would say it's not a hard no, but it's definitely a soft think hard about it. And then, the battery storage, great overview on resiliency. We just heard from New Ecology on. Just wanted to note on this one, you've got obviously battery storage qualifies under IRA, so a lot of the ITC calculations also hold there. And these are, situations where you've got high demand charges or a lot of grid outages, vulnerable tenants who are like on medical devices, et cetera. It can make some sense. And we've been modeling solar and storage a bit. It tends to need a little bit more grant funding. It doesn't stand alone super well, even just with IRA. But again, if your demand charges are high, it might. Or if there's other pressing needs there, if there's grant funds, yes. But if there's not grant funds, it's going to be a little harder to pencil, unless there's demand charges. So I'm going to stop yakking and then turn it over to questions, because I think there's probably a few questions out there.
Yeah, feel free to come off of mute if you have a question or add it to the chat.
No questions? I explained everything.
I have a question about community solar. Joshua Galloway with New Ecology. Do you see community solar happening very often, or is it really pretty rare kind of in the mid-Atlantic?
No, it's definitely growing, but it's only growing in the states where you can do it. And it's growing quickly in those states. especially with IRA now as a strong tailwind. There's additional grants that target just DOE has a bunch of grants out targeting just community solar specifically. I would note actually, this is really like, you know, a 20-minute 101 on solar. DOE has a great resource out now of if you want to work on community solar projects. It's basically like a whole curriculum, a 7-module curriculum that's now just been made available for free. There's a lot of great resources and presentations, which we can follow up with to provide the link on. But yeah, it's definitely growing, growing like over in like Northeast and California, Minnesota, Colorado, where the policy environment is strong.
This is Mi Young Lee from CHWorks. I wanted to go back to the own versus third party. I see that there are a couple of positives on the third party ownership. What might be the negative? And I'm looking at solar power sort of adding what is it, a value to the property? And is there any way that we could calculate that value?
The value to the property apart from the electricity savings?
Yeah, I mean, if third party ownership, I understand we do not own the system nor the power. We have to purchase it. But if we own it, okay, does that add to the overall property's value? And how much is that?
Oh, sure. From like an appraisal perspective,
right?
Yes, it does, and that's really a question for an appraiser, I think. But you can look at what the installed costs are, right, from the EPC and have a general sense, and then discount that, you know, for time.
Okay. What about the negatives of the third party ownership?
Yeah, you're losing out. Maybe I should have put a little negative in terms of all the financial benefits, right? All you're getting is the discounted power and maybe a little dev fee. You know, but it's offset a little bit by all the work and not having to finance the system.
Wouldn't that financial be offset? I mean, the financials in terms of the owning it, the negative, the financial, you're putting out all the money, but is that all the money that you're putting out, is that going to be 100% reimbursed by rebates and credits? Therefore, really, when you look at the financials on the third party, there might not be any.
Well, yeah. So your first question, like, you know, these days with the number of grants out there and EPA money, et cetera, you're definitely looking in LIHTC. You're definitely looking at situations, but over the long haul, you're not going to be out any money.
Right.
But, you know, in the short term, most certainly, right, for the construction to perm process. And, you know, yeah, but it still works, right? I mean, even if taking on some debt on a project is not always a bad thing.
Was there any like sort of the cost benefit analysis or long-term benefit analysis done in terms of financial for own versus third party?
Sure. So you own it. Those are kind of models A and B. That gives you a sense of what it looks like. Obviously, you have to tweak all the numbers for your own situation. But the third-party ownership, you know, the benefit stream there is essentially what your electricity savings are each year. And there's, you know, most PPA providers, that's power purchase agreement providers, are going to be, they'll have an escalator in there. Like maybe you're going to be, maybe your power rate's going to go up like 2% a year, which typically is less, especially these days, a lot less than what your the inflation rate on the electricity you're paying. These utilities we've been seeing 5 to 10% rate increases right across the Mid-Atlantic. So that's, you know, that's how you calculate the value of the PPA there, which the PPA providers are more than happy to go through with you. But that's it. And then any dev fee, development fees, yeah, you know, are not uncommon and should be requested. But those are kind of the two main sources of benefits.
Okay. That's good. Thank you.
The third party. Yep.
Hi, This is Matt Zajac, Cambridge Housing. A question on the expanded solar tax credit in the ITC. I believe there was some language in the legislation that required that a percentage of the benefit flow back to the low-income tenants, and there was a question open about how that could be achieved. I was curious if you had any insight on that point or any sense of when we might get guidance.
Great question. Yeah, these are a lot of details I didn't have a lot of time to dive into, but there's a couple of different scenarios, right, where the solar is on a master meter building versus a solar in individually metered building with common meters. The latest guidance document that came out from the from Treasury in May, which we provided comments on, I think the comment period ended like the end of June. We're still waiting on the final version on that. But yes, in that guidance, in that tentative guidance, Treasury is saying if you're providing that a certain percentage of benefits in the solar project needs to actually benefit the tenants in that project. And there's I'd say read the draft guidance to get a little bit more color on that. But in some cases, that the provider of power is going to sign an agreement with the property owner, and the property owner is going to need to commit to a benefits agreement that basically obligates them to provide certain benefits to tenants if they can't provide power, right? There's a lot of scenarios where you actually can't provide like a discount, discounted power to tenants if it's not individually metered. So you're looking at interesting structuring there, but it's not going to be that hard to do practically. But there's definitely some requirements to qualify for those tax credits that it's worth keeping an eye on. We'll know more, and I'm sure NHT will do an admirable job of summarizing what those requirements are once we have the final version of that guidance. You got time for one more question, Michael?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. We don't have any in the chat. Feel free to come off of mute. Brian, I wasn't sure. There was a question that came in earlier by email from one of our bootcamp participants. Just wondering if, specifically for for-profit tax credit properties, with the new sort of flexibility and sort of taking advantage of the ITC, the investment tax credit, what kind of, if you could speak to a little bit more detail there and some considerations there.
Sure. Yeah, so there's obviously for-profit owners of or LIHTC investors. The question, I read it a little bit. It was a little bit unclear to me whether the owner of the building was a nonprofit or for-profit entity. But essentially, you know, if you're a nonprofit, you're kind of going the direct pay route. And if you're for-profit, you're doing tax credit transfer, which you get a little bit less value for dollar for dollar. But that's you know, in this model that we've been discussing here, where you've got like an SPE set up, if the SPE is a for-profit entity, right? It could be third-party ownership, or it could be a nonprofit ownership under a nonprofit. Whatever that entity is, the nature of that entity, for-profit or nonprofit, decides what kind of tax credit tool you use, right? To monetize the ITC. So I'm not sure that quite answered the full question. I did read it, but if whoever wrote it could provide some color, I'd be happy to dive a little deeper.
Sure. Yeah, I had the same question. And we just got a question on the chat. Could you dig into SREX a bit more? I understand the federal ITC pretty well, but how do SREX integrate into a pro forma?
Sure. So SREX don't exist in every state. Where they do, there's typically an active market. And then there's a whole art, mostly art and some science to forecasting what those SREC values will be moving forward. And there are SREC buyers. The buyers will typically offer a spot price, or they will offer a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, and typically not much more than 5 year. Occasionally you see like 7 or 10 year strip, which locks in a fixed rate for those SREC prices. And so based on those market conditions, you can then model, expected contracted SREC values, and then much out beyond 5 years, it's, I would conservatively model a discounted rate based on the renewable portfolio standard that essentially drives the SREC market. So like, for instance, at NHT, when NHT models projects, we'll do like a 3 or 5 year strip locked in at like for DC SRECs at like 390 an SREC. And then beyond that, we're discounting the cap rate on the SRECs by about 70%, 60%, because we just don't know what the SREC prices are going to do. And you don't want to be too optimistic when it comes to solar. Those SREC prices, it's a market that can crash. It's a supply and demand thing, right? So that's why I say it's a little bit of an art, but there's SREC consultants out there who can help you state by state determine what might be a modest or conservative approach to modeling SRECs, on the out years.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. Thank you to the New Ecology and Brian for the great presentation, and I'll turn it over to Todd to wrap up.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so just wanted to, Brian had mentioned EPA's Solar for All program. We just wanted to provide kind of a quick update on the status of this program. So this will potentially provide resources to support residential solar, rooftop solar, community solar, as well as enabling upgrades. So think about, for example, improving roofs in order to install rooftop solar. $7 billion is available, and up to 60 states, territories, tribal governments, municipalities, and eligible nonprofits are eligible to receive funding. By eligible nonprofits, the legislation is pretty clear that that should include financial institutions such as green banks and CDFIs. So only financial institutions that have a mission to provide capital are eligible to apply for this funding. And there's more specifics about eligibility in the NOFO that came out a couple of weeks ago. So like I said, this is intended to benefit low-income and disadvantaged communities through affordable, resilient, and clean solar energy. All of this funding is to support low-income disadvantaged communities. I'll mention that affordable housing is categorically eligible for this funding, which was really good to see. And the intent is to provide a range of financial assistance, including subsidies, forgivable loans, soft loans. So, financial tools that I think, are really useful, especially in the affordable housing context. So states will be opting into this program. This is not, this is a competitive program, so states have to apply. We will know by August 1st which states have chosen to give their intent to apply for this funding. They have to submit a notice of intent to EPA by July 31st. So once that's done, then tribal governments, municipalities, and eligible nonprofits will also be required to submit a notice of intent. So with that background, I think we have a quick poll. I know that we're coming up against time, but wanted to just check the pulse of the group in terms of interest in solar. So if resources are available in your area through the Solar for All program, how likely are you to pursue solar opportunities? Very likely, because maybe the lack of financing is really the most significant barrier that you're finding to deploying solar. Somewhat likely, maybe funding is helpful, but there are other barriers to overcome, like technical assistance needs. Brian mentioned the challenge of investor consent. or maybe solar is just not a priority for you at this time, so you're not likely to. The Solar for All funding is not likely to change your perspective anytime soon. So just want to give folks a chance to respond to that survey and see what the group has to say. And I don't know, Madeline, if you could share the results. Okay, so it seems like the access to financing would be important and would increase the likelihood of some of you pursuing solar. And then a pretty similar percentage of you recognize that there are other challenges as well. So funding is part of the puzzle, but not the full solution. Okay, great. Can we go to the next slide? We just wanted to quickly end by kind of previewing some of the upcoming sessions. As Brian mentioned, we are expecting guidance from Treasury as well as the application for the low-income communities bonus solar tax credit. We're expecting that any day now. So at the end of August, we will focus our time on kind of sharing that information and helping folks understand how they might be able to apply for that tax credit. We're also expecting very shortly to get guidance from DOE on home energy rebate programs, and we'll be updating the group on that latest information there, and including, the process for accessing funding. And then we also want to talk about engaging residents. A lot of this funding does require owners to engage residents as part of the sort of the eligibility process. So we'll talk a little bit about how you all might be able to do that. So and that's it for us, unless anyone else from the NHT team has anything to add. Then we can adjourn, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.